Can you hear? We do have a strong connection to Mammoth. My father said that the best lives of his years were here in Mammoth. He got here in 1956, and we left in 1962. I was 10 when we left Mammoth. My brother was 8, and we went to live in Italy. And I'll be talking about that. The book came out in May of 2017, and it immediately went to a bestseller on Amazon, #1. We were a bestseller on USA Today, and now it's being translated in 35 languages around the world. We have a movie that was signed, and the actor to play my father in Beneath a Scarlet Sky is Tom Holland of Spider-Man fame. I actually was asked to go pick him up in Milan and bring him to and introduce him to my father this year in June, and I did that. My dad said, "Well, Mike, you know, his ears stick out." I said, "Dad, is that all you can say about this great actor? His ears stick out?" I said, "Well, Dad, you know, this is Hollywood. They can make your ears stick out. No, they have the technology to do that." He was happy with that. Anyhow, he's 92 and living in Lezza, Italy, a little village north of Milan. The book has gone viral, mainly thanks to Amazon. It's taken captive because of the digital world, and we are so lucky. I was involved in this project for 10 years, since 2006, and you never know if a book is going to be successful or not. Most books are not, actually, quite frankly. And this one is, and I'm so honored to be part of it, to come speak here at Mammoth, a place where I have very, very fond memories. We grew up on Mono Street. Now I hear it's the ghetto. Bruce and I, as kids, would look at this mountain over here back in the 50s. There was nothing on it at that time. And we would wonder, what's on the other side? What's on the other side? And as little boys, I was probably 7 and he was 5. We took a trip one day. We left the house against Mom's wishes, and we climbed this mountain right up here. He doesn't even remember. We found a dead coyote that really impressed us. And we got to the top of the mountain and we could see on the other side. What a wonderful thing that was. And the book is a little bit like that, Beneath the Scarlet Sky. We always want to see what's on the other end. My father never talked about this story. This was a secret that he kept inside. And I've been speaking now since 2017 when the book came out. And I go around and do talks like this. It's just wonderful for me. I meet people all the time. It's great. Anyhow, the story starts in 1938, actually. I'll get to that. But this is Mark Sullivan. As you know, I'm not the writer. I'm just the son of the protagonist. The credit goes to Mark. Mark was James Patterson's #1 co-writer. James Patterson, of course, everybody knows who he is, a very prolific writer. He had written 5 New York Times bestsellers after 2006. He was also a Pulitzer Prize nominee for investigative reporting when he used to work with the San Diego, I think it was the Tribune. But for the last 10 years, since my retirement in 2007, I have worked with Mark on this story. I majored in journalism, so I know a little bit about writing. I don't have the talent to write a novel like he does, of course. But I've helped him lay out the story. I've provided him with family information that my dad didn't want to talk about. Mark Sullivan is the one who deserves the credit at a time when he was down and out, depressed. His brother had just died. He had written a book that nobody was interested in. He'd moved his family to Bozeman, Montana, of all places. And with his very last resources, one night in January of 2006, when he was contemplating suicide himself, he heard the story about a young 17-year-old boy who escorted Jews over the most treacherous terrain of the Italian Alps, and then became a spy for one of the most powerful German commanders in the Third Reich. He heard the story, couldn't believe it. He said, if this is true, we would have heard about it. He called me up that night. It was on a Friday night, I'll never forget it. It was like 1 o'clock at night. He'd just gone to this party, woke me up. He said, Mike, my name is Mark, and I'm a novelist. I'd like to get your dad's phone number. And I gave it to him. I said, what for? He said, well, because I heard the story about your father. Stuff that I had never heard of. His dad never talked about it to us, to me and Bruce. Anyhow, he called my father that night and asked if he can come to Italy with his last resources. He wanted to write something that was compelling, that he thought would make a difference in the world. And my dad said, well, why do you want to come see me, of all people? I'm more of a coward than a hero. My father believed that he was a coward. He didn't want to talk about it, like many Italians. And we'll talk about that a little later. But with his last resources, he flew to Italy, and he spent 3 weeks with my dad, and my father opened up his heart like he has to nobody else in his whole life. He spilled his guts. This was a picture taken of Mark in 2006 when they met. They spent 3 weeks together, and he brought him to all those places. The treacherous trails over the Alps, the places where he was shot at, the places where he was with the general, so on. And at the very end, on the last night, before Mark was going to come back to Italy, to the United States, my father was up crying all night. And Mark had said, Pino, what's wrong? I've been here 3 weeks. You showed me all around. My dad said, there's one more thing. There's one more thing I didn't talk about. And he brought up the word Anna, the mystery woman. And the book is now based on the story. It's a love story. We knew nothing about Anna. My brother and I never heard of her. My mother never heard of Anna. His second wife, Yvonne, never heard of Anna. I said, Bruce, did you hear Anna? No. My mom's name is Patricia Anna. Of all things, Patricia Ann, really. But she had told me one time that my dad would wake up in nightmares and he'd mention the word Anna. My mom thought he was having nightmares about her. Not nightmares, but at least he was dreaming about her. She knew nothing of Anna. Unfortunately, she died in 1998. She doesn't get to know about this story. He never talked about it. Bruce and I knew bits and pieces, but Mark is the one that put the whole puzzle together. And to us, it was a revelation to know how and why my dad was so crazy during his life. I mean, he actually suffered from post-traumatic syndrome before we knew what it was. My aunt, Chichi, she told me, I'm sure she told Bruce, that my father was involved in a bombing accident in Modena, Italy, when he was in the Nazi boot camp. And he wound up in a coma for 10 to 12 days. When you wind up in a coma for 10 to 12 days, it can have a serious effect on your personality, on your character. It can change it. Chichi said that he was never the same after that bombing. Anyhow, the story begins in 1938. This is a picture of my dad on the left. He's 12 years old. His brother, Mimo, 2 years younger, just like I have a brother 2 years younger, is 10. We also have a sister 10 years. I have a sister 10 years younger. He has a sister 10 years younger. My father is Joseph Pino for short. His brother is Mimo, Domenico. Bruce is named after Domenico. I'm named after my grandfather. Anyhow, Il Duce, Benito Mussolini, had made the single biggest mistake of his life on this day, June 10th, 1940, by declaring war against Britain and France. And he joined Hitler in an effort to save Italy's fledgling little empire. You see, Mussolini saw himself as the new Caesar of Rome. They had started to acquire little countries like Ethiopia and Albania, and Mussolini thought that by joining Hitler, he would save the Italian Empire. His biggest mistake. Other than that, he was very loved. He got Italy out of the Depression, and he made the trains run on time. That was a big deal. For the Lella brothers, and I'm going to set the stage, this is not in the book. For the Lella brothers, Il Duce is all they knew during their short lives. Had it not been for their father, my grandfather seen here on the left, Don Michele, they too would have succumbed to the fanatic fascist indoctrination of the period. See, it was brainwashing, just like it was in Germany. All Italians were forced to believe in Mussolini. The patriarch of our family was Don Michele. I'm named after him. And he was not the one that wore the pants in the family. That really was our grandmother, Porzia. We called her Gemma. In fact, Bruce, I don't know if you've ever heard the word Porzia. I've never heard of that before. I have never. We called her Gemma. Anyhow, she's the one that wore the pants in the family. She was a good business lady. She had 3 brothers that were all prominent businessmen in Milan. The oldest brother owned a Bugatti dealership. But she was the one that wore the pants, and my grandfather was an artist. He played the violin beautifully. He was an accountant for the firm, and they had a nice little business. If it wasn't for the strong teaching of my grandfather, our grandfather, I should say, I always say my, but now my brother's here, I have to say our. They never would have known the ways of the world. You see, during that period in Italy, just like Germany, you had no choice. My father and Uncle Mimo were born and raised under Mussolini's fascism. Mussolini came into power in 1922. My father was born in 1926. At school, they were forced to memorize and follow their savior, their leader, their emperor, the emperor's every word. In fact, all Italians were forced to obey. And the authority at that time in Italy was imposed by the black shirts, camicie nere, for you people that are learning Italian here, black shirts, camicie nere, camicie nere. And the camicie nere were less feared than the Gestapo and the brown shirts of Germany, but they did maintain an iron rule. Benito famously said one day, he said, Italy wants peace, quiet, work, and calm. He said, I will bring these things to Italy. And he was very pompous about it. He said, I will bring these things with love. You know, Italians, with love. He said, but with force, if necessary. And we have to keep in mind that he was a dictator. And Mussolini considered the children to be the fascists of the future. And the state, at that time, did everything they could to brainwash and indoctrinate the Italian youth. That's not mentioned in the book. My father and Uncle Mimo were raised to believe that fascism was the way of the future. It was not the case in our family, very fortunately, because my grandfather, he was a musician, and he was educated. 30% of Italy at that time, 30% was illiterate. And he was an educated man. But he carried a carta fascista. You know what a carta fascista is? A fascist card. He had to run his wife's business. His wife, our grandmother, Porzia, she ran an elegant little purse shop at the time. It was called Le Borsette di Lella. Bruce and I didn't know that. It was called Lella Sport later. But at the time, it was a purse shop. and it was located on Via Monte Napoleone. This is the Rodeo Drive of Milan, which is now the capital of the world for fashion. And they lived in an apartment right above that on Via Monte Napoleone. Don Michele himself, our grandfather, he was no stranger to the war. He had been one of the first lieutenants, youngest lieutenants I should say, in World War I, when Italy was on the right side. He never liked Mussolini. He was with the Carabinieri, and as Mussolini took power, he was always against him. And yes, Nonno Michele, as we affectionately called him, he saw the writing on the wall. 2 years before the war started, he brought his niece, and this is important in the story. Her name was Licia Albanese. He brought her up from Bari, Italy, and she lived in the house on Via Monte Napoleone, and he gave her voice lessons. And she became one of the greatest sopranos in the world in the 50s and 40s. But she lived in the house for five years. And he put her on that very last flight that left Europe. It was a Pan Am Clipper flight, leaving Europe, going to New York. And Nonno Michele told me personally, he said, he put her on that flight and he told her, Licia, never come back to Italy until it is free from tyranny. She came with Toscanini, the great Italian director. You know what? She never came back to Italy. She settled in New York. She married an American citizen. She sang at the Met. She became very famous. This is my father's first cousin. And she lived in the house and would do voice lessons. So, for the moment, Michele had little to worry about his two boys. You see, they were not indoctrinated. They were not subject to that brainwashing. Besides, my father kept a secret. While Licia was taking all those opera voice lessons, he would lock himself in the privacy of his room and he would listen to jazz. And he fell in love with jazz and everything American. He did this on his little BBC radio. That was illegal at the time. From the London channel out of England, BBC. And he would listen to what was really going on in the world. He could speak English, by the way. And he fell in love with everything American. In February 1943, the British, they began an intensive bombing campaign of Milan. I don't know if you know this, it's not mentioned anywhere, but Milan was one of the first cities to be carpet bombed. This is before Berlin and all the German cities. Milan was being punished by the British for declaring war on England. And it lasted for 6 months. How many people here have been to Milan? Can I get a raise of hands? It was carpet bombed. 6 months. You can imagine the terror. Initially, these nightly raids, they were supposed to be targeting military and industrial complexes. But like any bombing, they missed their targets. By the end of the summer, those notti da inglese, what does that mean for you Italians, people learning Italian? Notti da inglese, it means British nights. By the end of the summer, those British nights were resulting in the massacre of hundreds of Milanese, Italian citizens. Over 400,000 Milanese went homeless. That's out of a population of 1.5 million. It was a big city in those days. A third of the population went homeless. In 1962, when Bruce and I went to live in Italy, they were still cleaning up the rubble from the bombing of Milan. In fact, we used to play in the rubble at that time. On the night of, this is the Galleria, by the way. If you've been to Milan, you had to go to the Galleria, the Duomo. Look at that, it's damaged. Here's the Duomo over here. On the night of August 7th, 1943, my father and Uncle Mimo narrowly escaped death following the bombing of a movie theater. It was called Il Cristallo. We actually Googled this, Mark Sullivan and I. They were there watching You Were Never Lovelier with Rita Hayworth and Fred Astaire. And my dad had been stood up by a girl that he had been smitten by. He fell in love at first sight, always. And he had made a deal with this young, beautiful girl to meet him at the movie theater. Instead, his little brother, Uncle Mimo, shows up, and she was not there. The British bombed that night, and they barely got out alive. There were 16 people that were killed at that movie theater, stampeded to death. You can imagine, 16 and 14-year-old boys. By the time they got back to their apartment, Don Michele, our grandfather, had made up his mind. He said, that's it. I'm going to send you two boys up in the Alps to get away from the bombing, where they had learned to ski as children. It was a camp back there in their youth, and they both became very, very good skiers. The school was located high in the Alps, close to the Swiss border. It was called Casa Alpina, and it was run by a very courageous priest by the name of Don Luigi Re. There they learned many skills. They learned to love the mountains, rock climbing, winter survival, and again, both of them became great skiers. On July 10th, 1943, the Allies, they land in Sicily, and 2 weeks later, Mussolini's fascist Grand Council, they convened a meeting without him, and in a vote of 19-8, they decided to depose Mussolini, get him out of power. They saw the writing on the wall too. How could you not? The Americans had landed in Sicily. Il Duce is arrested the following day while pleading his case with King Vittorio Emanuele III. This guy right here, he was like 4 feet tall, very short guy. That is when the chaos in Italy really begins. Real serious chaos. Half of Italy agrees, the other half is fanatic still about Mussolini. Mussolini is then transported in secret. He's arrested, transported in secret to this place high in the Apennine Mountains. It's called Gran Sasso in the Campo Imperatore Hotel. He's held here as prisoner. When Hitler finds out about it, and it was supposed to be in secret, but he finds out like the very next day, he's outraged. He puts together one of the most daring raids in World War II. He orders his bodyguard, this guy, a guy by the name of Otto Skorzeny. He was an assassin, really, a brutal man, an SS Waffen lieutenant colonel. He orders him to go and rescue Italy's greatest son. So on the afternoon of September 12th, 1943, they plan and they carry out one of the most daring raids in World War II that gets little publicity. 12 gliders, they didn't have helicopters in those days, 12 gliders crash land on the top of this mountain called the Big Rock, Gran Sasso, and they rescue Mussolini without firing a shot. That was on September 12th, 1943. Skorzeny then, he has this airplane. It was designed specifically for this. It was called a Storch. He had no helicopters. This plane could take off in 600 meters. They load Mussolini on board. Mussolini wants to bring his luggage and his girlfriend. And Skorzeny says, no way. It's just you, me, and the pilot. I've got to get you to Austria because we have a plane going out to Berlin and you're going to be speaking with Hitler the very next day. And that's what happened. It is said that Skorzeny had to put a gun to the head of the pilot because he didn't want to take off. And this plane clipped a tree on takeoff with Mussolini on board. By the way, none of this is in the book. I set this up because you need to know what's going on at the time. Mussolini is then meeting with Hitler in Berlin the very next day, and they decide what to do with Italy. Hitler says, I'm in charge now. They commandeer the Italian industry. They convert the Italian factories into German armament manufacturing. Remember, keeping in mind that at the time the Allies were bombing the Rhone Valley and all the famous and powerful industrial war machine was being bombed by the Allies. So they converted the Italian factories into the war machine. They set Mussolini in a puppet government in the town of Salo, this little town right here on Lake Garda. But he's really a prisoner of the Nazis. He remains in custody of the Germans. The Nazis, in the meantime, while occupying northern Italy, they began their hunt for Italian Jews. You know, initially, the Italians knew nothing of the Nazi brutality against Jews. They did know that they were being rounded up and shipped away, but that's it. It was not until October of 1943, 52 prominent Italian Jews were rounded up in the little town of Mena on Lago Maggiore, not far from where my father lives today, about 4 miles away. They were rounded up there. Their hands were tied behind their backs. They were escorted into the piazza. All the citizens of the village were ordered out to witness the slaughter of 52 Italian Jews. Their bodies were thrown into Lake Maggiore. It was then that Italians were outraged of what the Nazis were doing to their own fellow brother and sister Jews. They rose, many people rose, to protect Italian Jews at the risk of their own lives. They began hiding them in the basements of monasteries, churches, convents, and if they were caught, they were executed on the spot. It was a horrible, horrible time in history that we should never forget. Italians tried to help them escape, risking their own lives. They set up an underground railroad, a network similar to the one that was set up to save American slaves during the US Civil War. And one of these network tracks led through to Casalpina. This is where my father and Uncle Mimo were waiting out the bombing of Milan. My father, at the time, was the oldest of boys at this it was exclusively a boys' school. He was the oldest. In fact, he told me he thought he was so sophisticated that he didn't want to be there. He wanted to stay in Milan where he could find this mystery girl, Anna, of course. But he was ordered to go there. And he was 16, and he thought he was a big shot man, and all the other boys were 14 and younger. So he didn't want to be there. Don Luigi Ray singled him out and started training him to go on missions, and he didn't know what these missions were for. They would get him up at 2 and 3 in the morning and have him go on these arduous hikes. They start training him like they would an athlete to build up his strength and to learn the terrain. He didn't know what he was doing. He just did what he was told to do at that time. But he eventually became responsible for leading numerous escapes of Jews and teaching the other boys those escape routes. Between the ages of 16 and 17, while he was there, he personally guided, we estimate, there's no way of knowing, over 100 Italian Jews that paid really good money, by the way, to get there. And several US downed pilots by leading them over the Alps into neutral Switzerland. During this 1.5-year period, while at Casa Alpina, he evaded Nazi patrols. He survived avalanches, of all things, grenade attacks. He was robbed by bandits. This was an area of contraband. He ran from partisans who disguised themselves. He carried the weak and the elderly on his back over the top of the Alps, some of the world's most treacherous terrain at that time, in the dead of winter into neutral Switzerland, sometimes while these people were in street clothes and below zero temperatures. It was incredible. They set up an elaborate signal system using lights that was established between Casa Alpina, this boys' school, and the little village of Campo Dolcino down below. Here's a picture we actually found online of my father just, in the area. Anyhow, there was this is the plateau of Casa Alpina right here, and this is the village of Campo Dolcino here. When the Nazis were patrolling this road, they had to take one of 3 routes. They were very treacherous. This one was up the spine to the Gropera, and it took technical alpine skills to get up here. The wind would blow on the spine, of course, and there was less snow, less chance of avalanches. When the road, the other route was up to Splugen Pass, up in that direction there. They would signal down to here, and there was a little steeple down here now that's buried in the trees. But we found it. I went there a few years ago, and we found the steeple where they would signal up to Casa Alpina. This was a very deadly route because there were avalanches coming from here. In the book, it describes of an avalanche that they were caught into, and it was at the very top of the Gropera up here. The avalanche came down from here. They would ski down to here and meet with the Swiss at Val d'Ilay. There's no pictures like this in the book. You guys are privileged. Anyhow, during this time at Casa Alpina, my father developed a friendship. This is a picture, by the way, I took looking down from Casa Alpina, looking down at the village of Campo Dolcino. You can see the scale of things. During this period, my father would always try to go to Medesimo. It was a ski resort not far from where he was staying, and he developed a friendship with this guy. His name is Alberto Ascari. The book talks like they met there. It's not really true. I will tell you what's true and what's not true in the book. There are a lot of misnomers. But Alberto Ascari later became a 2-time world driving champion with Ferrari. And he taught my dad how to drive a car. But not just how to drive a car, how to push a car to its limits. They used to time each other going up and down the road, racing his little Fiat at the time. Alberto Ascari was also in Medesimo waiting out the bombing of Milan, and he had just been married, and he had a 2-year-old son. His name was Tonino, and I was very good friends with Tonino. On the spring of 1944, my father is summoned to Milan by his Uncle Albert and Aunt Greta. It was for an urgent meeting before his 18th birthday on June 1st. Uncle Albert and Aunt Greta, they owned a suitcase factory and a leather shop. In fact, all the remnants of the leather, Uncle Albert would give to his sister, our grandmother, and she would make purses with that. It was not far, his factory was not far from his mother's Borsette di Lella store. And Uncle Albert and Greta were involved in the resistance. They sat my dad down and they gave him 2 choices. They said, Pino, you are turning 18, you're going to be drafted. There's no choices. You either join the Italian Fascist Army or you join the Nazis. They said if you join the Nazis, the Italian Fascist Army, you're going to wind up on the Russian front. If you join the Nazis, we can get you in to the organization Todt. That was the armaments and the construction division of the Third Reich. It was huge. They had connections with the German high command because they were customers of the store. And Greta, my dad's uncle's wife, was of German origin. So all the head command of the Nazis, they would go there and as customers of the store, and Greta would set them up with the best restaurants and the places where to stay, all that kind of thing. My father, reluctantly, he takes their advice, and he reluctantly dons a Nazi uniform and the organization Todt swastika. He's ordered to boot camp, a German boot camp in Modena. Then, through a series of really extraordinary circumstances, whereby he loses the use of his index finger. Here's a picture where his hand is in a cast. He was involved in a bombing while at boot camp. He wound up flipping upside in the air and landing on his head, and he got knocked out. He wakes up in the hospital 12 days later after being in a coma, and they sewed his finger back on, and they said, Pino, you're no good in boot camp. You go back home for 2 weeks and convalesce. And that's when it happened. He goes back to Milan, and through a series of just extraordinary circumstances, and with the help of Uncle Albert and Greta, he becomes the personal driver and the confidant of one of Hitler's most mysterious and powerful commanders in the German high command. A man so powerful that he responded only to Adolf Hitler. He was head of the organization Todt. You see, this man, General Leyers, had a chauffeur that could not speak German. My father didn't speak German, but he spoke French. And he communicated with Leyers in French. He called him Mon General. And Leyers wanted a driver that he could communicate with. He also wanted a driver that could drive the car. And Dad was a good driver, even at 17 years old. So he became, through this series of extraordinary circumstances, the driver of one of the most powerful generals in Italy at the time, Nazi generals. In time, he manages to befriend Leyers. Leyers treated him like a subservient, but little by little, especially after having saved his life on more than one occasion, Leyers opens up to him. But more importantly, while driving for this general in the German high command, he learns the location of every tank trap, every pillbox, every ammunition tunnel, every fortification between Florence and Milan. They set up the Gothic line, which was somewhere around here. Remember, the Allies had moving their way up the boot of Italy. And the last dance was called the Gothic line. He witnesses the building of the Gothic line. He observes the building of this line, and he takes this general all through northern Italy for more than a year. He documents troop movements, he takes notes, he takes photos, and he fed that classified information to his uncle Albert, who had been given an OSS radio, this is pre-CIA, by the Allies. And my father transferred that information that was passed through Uncle Albert's clandestine radio, it was a shortwave radio, that he and his girlfriend, this girl Anna, who wound up becoming, remember the one that stood him up at the movie theater? Well, she turned out to be the the maid of General Leyers' mistress, of all things. People call this unbelievable. Can't be. It's too Forrest Gump-like. But it happened. It turns out that that girl that stood him up was the maid of General Leyers' mistress. And that makes the story, doesn't it? You know, the punishment for spying was immediate execution. My father and Anna took the radio that Uncle Albert had, and the Nazis, his house had been bombed, so they moved to a place called Corso Matteotti, number 8. Bruce and I lived there when we went to Italy. And our grandparents lived on the 8th floor, and on the 6th floor there was a prominent dentist. They kicked him out of the house, and they reserved it for the Gestapo headquarters. And they were gonna, that apartment was going to be for Hitler had he come to Milan. And they had a Gestapo antenna there. And my father and his girlfriend brought that radio, they hooked it to the antenna because the Nazis were trying to triangulate and find out where all the signals were coming from. They knew that classified information was getting out to the Allies, but they never suspected that it was coming from their own antenna. It was a daring move and a very exciting moment in my father's life. He looked at this as adventure and fun, really, at the time. That's what we asked him. Again, the punishment for spying was immediate execution. See, during this time, my dad had fallen in love with this girl, Anna, the maid of General Leyers' mistress. Together, they brought that radio up into that apartment. It was a dramatic moment in the book. Keep in mind, our Uncle Albert, he built suitcases, and he built a false bottom, and he put that radio there. And they had to trick the SS guards into allowing through. To the Allies, our father became known as the Observer. The Observer. He thought he was called Aquila. Aquila in Italian means eagle. He witnesses the helpless rounding up of Italian Jews, and he personally delivers his general to speak with Mussolini routinely. Imagine growing up thinking this is Mussolini as a god, and now you're driving this guy to meet with Mussolini. In the book it says that my dad helped translate for General Leyers with Mussolini. Not really true, it was a bit of an exaggeration. My dad waited outside. He did bring General Leyers to meet with Mussolini in the town of Salo, but he always sat outside. There were times when he was called up into the room, but Mussolini spoke French, and there was no need for my dad to translate. That was an exaggeration, one of the few. There are some few exaggerations that I can talk about later. Anyhow, on the night of May, it was April 30th, no, pardon me, excuse me. Don't want to get my cards mixed up. Here we go. We're getting towards the end. On the night of April 24th, 1945, as northern Italy was descending into the last days of the war, it was chaos. My father is asked to arrest his general, single-handedly. He's 18 years old, keep in mind. There was curfew in Milan, and General Leyers had some kind of business that he had to do, and he was asked on April 24th, 1945, to personally arrest his general and deliver him to the Americans who were waiting in a place called Terza, meaning third Zat. General Leyers comes out of a building. The streets of Milan are quiet, and he walks up to the car, and my father pulls out a Luger pistol they had given him and handcuffs they had given him. And he says, "General Leyers, you're under arrest. I want you to drive the car. I'm going to sit in the back." And General Leyers, of course, tries to talk his way out of it. But my father said, shut up, do not talk unless you're spoken to, because that's what General Leyers used to tell him all the time. Anyhow, they go to the Terza Zat, and this is not in the book, but my dad told me that when they got there, nobody was there. Nobody. You can imagine, you just arrested one of the most powerful generals in the German High Command. You're 18 years old. You're ordered to deliver him to a place, and when you get there, there's nobody there. That's not in the book either, but that's what really happened. He didn't know what to do with him, so he decided to bring him to his parents' house, because he didn't. And it was midnight, after midnight, and they cooked a pot of spaghetti, and they ate spaghetti till 6 o'clock in the morning. That's what he told me that really happened. Yeah. You can imagine what a moment in his life after all those years of Milan being bombed, the terror, everything he went through, and he's ordered to deliver this this general to the Americans. He'd always dreamed of America. He does get the general to the American command at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he meets this man by the name of Frank Nabel. Frank Nabel led the platoon that first got into Italy, and he was there under instructions and orders to meet with the observer, my father, didn't know his name, and receive the general. You can imagine that moment. So now, for the next 5 days, my dad gets to become Major Nabel's personal guide. He throws away his Nazi uniform, his swastika, and he tells his brother, I'm not a traitor. His brother believed him to be a traitor. And they really had some very difficult moments together. And now he could tell his brother that he's not a traitor. He can tell his family that he's not a traitor. Uncle Albert and Greta, they always knew. On April 28th, the two of them, Major Nabel and my father, who is now speaking English instead of French, they witnessed the desecration and the display of Mussolini's body in Milan's Piazzale Loreto. This was one of the most dramatic moments in Italy during World War II. Il Duce had been executed the day before while trying to escape Italy, along with his mistress, Clara Petacci. The events of this day had a serious and a long-term effect on my father. He could never get over the hysteria and the fanaticism of the Italian mobs he saw that day. Hitler kills himself 2 days later on April 30th, 1945. On May 2nd, the day the hostilities in Italy were supposed to be over, Major Nabel asked my father if he would do America a favor. A favor. At this stage in my father's life, he was at his most distraught moment, and I won't give it up, you have to read the book. He accepted anything. He would accept anything from Major Nabel. He was asked to report to the American command at midnight on May 3rd and to accept a mission that he knew nothing about. When he got there, he was told to escort a hero of America. He arrives with a friend by the name of Carletto Beltramini, who I remember very well. And Major Nabel and the platoon, they took the little Fiat that my father had borrowed from Uncle Albert, and they painted a star on the top of the hood. They put new tires on it. And they gave him a box containing two 45 U.S. Thompson submachine guns. Imagine 18-year-old kids getting these submachine guns with 45 caliber rotary magazines. And they said, Pino, if you want to accept this mission, you're to drive this hero of America over the Brenner Pass. The Brenner Pass was one of the most dangerous places in Europe at the time. The remaining Nazis were trying to flee through to the Austrian border. The Americans were chasing them down, and so were the Patriots and the partisans, pardon me. It was through the Brenner Pass, one of the most dangerous places to be. Who was this hero? Believe it or not, his general. General Hans Leyers. Now he was in a civilian uniform, and he came out with a valise chained to his hands with handcuffs. And he came out with a big smile, and he looked at my dad and pointed at him. We never knew why the Americans would have an 18-year-old kid drive this powerful general to the Austrian border, but it happened. On May 2nd, 1945, the day the hostilities ended, my father chose to accept this mission. It was a daring mission, ordered and concocted by the Americans. So the story ends with my father becoming a guide one very last time, leading one final mission out of Italy. It was really a suicide mission concocted by American forces, mysteriously designed to save and protect this high-ranking Nazi officer because of the intelligence he possessed about Hitler's Reich. Leyers was delivered to the Americans that night, May 3rd, 1945. And that daring mission and the events of that week ended World War II for our father. But the experience continues to haunt him to this very day. You see, there were roughly 49,000 Italian Jews at the time of the Nazi invasion. 41,000, not bad. 41,000 evaded arrest. Many Italians, not just my father, not just Don Luigi Ray, many Italians selflessly risked their lives to save Jews from the Nazi brutality. No one knows how many were murdered for simply trying to help. Our father cannot consider himself a hero knowing that fact, and he doesn't like it. Now he's been called a hero, he doesn't like that at all. Some 60 to 70,000 Allied soldiers, Americans, lost their lives to free Italy from the Nazis. 140,000 Italian citizens lost their lives in Italy during this period of time. 140,000 citizens lost their lives during Nazi occupation of Italy. So little has been known and written about the battle for the boot of Italy that they have taken to calling it the Forgotten Front. You see, the battle for the boot of Italy lasted 2 years. The fighting from the landing in Normandy on D-Day to the surrender of Berlin lasted 11 months. I don't want to demean that. It was a horrific war, the Battle of the Bulge. But many more Americans, many more Allies lost their lives in Italy. And Beneath the Scarlet Sky wants to bring that out. It's a story about a small life that ended up mattering on that forgotten front in a big way. It's a story of a boy who lost his innocence from 5 years of ravaged war during the best time of his life. Here you can see our father sitting in the exact same spot nearly 77 years later, the spot where his father would teach him the values of prosperity, of peace, of freedom, of music, all the good things in life. Values that kept him from becoming indoctrinated into fascism. Anyhow, that's the end of my discussion. I will take some questions. And I always have, at the end of these things, I always have I like to answer a few questions, and one of them is, before you ask me, is why is this a novel? And how did this story get told? And what about Pino now? How did he wind up in the United States? That's always asked of me. We know that 90% of this story is accurate. Mark Sullivan was a Pulitzer Prize investigating reporter. But there was very little evidence. It was all the word of an old man. The Nazis were famous for destroying documents while they left Italy. And there's a collective amnesia in Italy. The Italians don't like to talk about the war because they're ashamed of what happened. Mark Sullivan had to create a dialogue, and that's all fictitious, of course, so they turned it into a novel. My father wanted it to be a historical documentary. Instead, it would turn out to be a love story, and he didn't care for that at all. You can imagine. There were a few details that were constructed. What we heard as children was very, very little. Like most veterans of World War II, he didn't talk about the war. In 1986, there was a research project going on. It was called the Altruistic Project. And there was a PhD that found our father's name on a list of people who had gone out of their way to help save Jews. He was on that list. They contacted him. At the time, he didn't want to talk about it. Mark Sullivan approached him just at a moment in his life where he wanted to open his heart. And that's how the book came about. Here's a picture of me and my father, I keep on saying our dad. Last year, I tried to get him to come live here, and it just didn't. He prefers to stay in Italy and spend the last year of his life there. Everybody asks me, how did he wind up in the United States? Well, this is where Mammoth comes in. At the end of the war, he had to finish up his service, like every soldier. And the Americans left behind some old bombers. One of them was called a Baltimore. And they said, Pino, we know you've done some good things for the Allies. What do you want to do? We'll give you your choice. And he said, well, you know, I think I'd like to learn to be a pilot. And at the end of the war, they put him on an airplane that was called a Baltimore. And the Italians barely knew how to fly these things. They were left over. We're talking 1946, 47. Anyhow, he's assigned in the Italian Air Force, and on his very first flight, he's ordered into the turret of one of these bombers. And the young Italian pilot who was flying this thing forgot to put the landing gear down on landing. You can imagine being in the bottom of this thing, and the landing gear is still up. He got out in the nick of time, and there was a lieutenant that was killed in this crash. They said, Pino, you still want to be a pilot? He says, no. He said, is there anything else I can do? I said, well, we heard you did some good things for the Allies. We'll give you your choice. What do you want to do? He said, well, I'm a good skier. I can ski. He said, okay, well, we'll make you the ski instructor for the Italian Officer Corps. So he winds up finishing his military service in a place called Cortina d'Ampezzo, and he becomes the ski instructor, the only one, of the Italian Officer Corps. Then the war ends, it's over, he finishes service, but there's still vendetta killings going on in Italy. And it lasted for a few years. His parents were afraid that he was going to be killed. Remember, he wore a swastika. And whatever he did, it was all clandestine, it was all secret. So they sent him to Paris to go to school, try to get him out of Italy. And he's in Paris one day, and the Italian ski team approaches him and says, Pino, how would you like to be on the Italian ski team? We're going to Aspen, Colorado, United States, for the first post-war World Championships. And they had a skier at that time by the name of Zeno Collot, who was like the best. At the time, he was the Jean-Claude Killy. In fact, he won the downhill and the slalom in Aspen, Colorado. They were sort of inaugurating Aspen at the time. My dad lands a position on the Italian ski team. He gets here, and they say, Mr. Lella, we understand you've been a professional ski instructor. You can't compete. This was the Olympic team. he's already here, and he's the only one that could speak English. So we say, how about it if you be the translator of the team? And there was one girl. Her name was Selina Chegi. And he said, why don't you be the coach of the female team? There's only one female. And he's officially recognized as the coach of the women's team and the translator, but he was actually there to compete. Anyhow, the Italians win the World Championships in Aspen, Colorado. And one night, they were celebrating at a restaurant, and in the table right next to Zeno Kalo, my father, and a few other people, is Ernest Hemingway and Gary Cooper, the actor. You people are way too young to know who those people are, I'm sure. But Gary Cooper was a big fan of opera, and he was also a car buff. And my dad had this connection. His cousin was the best opera singer in the world, and his best friend, of course, was world champion with Ferrari. And Gary Cooper loved my dad and said, here, Pino, if you ever come to Southern California, come look me up. And that's what happened. The team goes back to Italy. My father defects, and he goes to New York. And Licia Albanese, who now is very famous, says, what do you want to do? Well, I got this offer to go to Southern California. I think I'm going to do that and meet Mr. Cooper. So he shows up in Southern California, meets Gary Cooper and a bunch of other people. And Gary Cooper says, what do you want to do in life? And I can get you in the Screen Actors Guild. Oh, no, I don't. I'm a skier and I'm a race car driver. I'm not an actor. But I would like to meet some American girls if you know of any. and my father gets set up on a blind date with our mother, Patricia, who Nick Gunner knew very, very well. And I have to say, he's one of the last living persons who knew my mother, Nick Gunter. He's here tonight. Won't you please give him my hand? In fact, I remember, Nick, the day they opened T-Bar #1, you and my mom were in front of us. I think you were one of the very first people on the T-Bar when it opened. Do you remember that? Sort of. And I remember they fell, and I was laughing and going up and looking. I was 9 years old at the time, but I'll never forget that. Anyhow, my mom was teaching she wasn't teaching, she was the secretary of the physics department at UCLA, secretary. And after their very first date, blind date, my father goes to see our mother working at UCLA and wants to take her out to lunch. And she says, Pino, I've been talking to somebody here who wants to meet you. He speaks Italian. And out comes Albert Einstein, so in 3 weeks, he meets Gary Cooper and Ernest Hemingway and Albert Einstein, and he calls up his parents and says, you know, this is great, I'm not coming home. That's what happened. And it was one thing after another for the next 10 years. They got married, and I was born, I hope, 9 months later in March. Bruce was born in 1954, I was born in 1952, and we had a sister born in 1961. Anyhow, we lived in Mammoth. He becomes a ski instructor in Southern California, a place called Wrightwood. There was very little snow down there. Just like that, he would be a ski instructor where there's no snow. So he moved his way on up, and he heard about Mammoth Mountain in 1956. It was just starting then. And there were very few people here. Nick was here. Dave, of course. Yes, you were here. Murphys. I remember the Murphys. Oh my gosh, Bruce, Murphys. Our neighbors. There were very few families. I remember the Wardas and the Murphys. Oh, I can tell you stories. Yeah, wow. The Murphys. It brings up so many memories. Yeah, here's a picture. Some of you may have seen this. You know, when I travel around doing these talks, nobody knows how important this logo was. I remember the night my dad drew that to me and my brother on an envelope. And there's some controversy about it. Somebody said Bob Cooper did it, but I know my dad drew that picture. It's his style. He was a cartoon artist. He was really good at it. It became a famous logo. And Dave and Nick, and they allowed him to teach privately. He had a connection with the movie stars. James Dean, for example, Gary Cooper, of course. We all know Mammoth is the place where all the Hollywood skis, and particularly in those days. And it was a real art. And in those days, the ski instructors were very much professionals. It was a living. And he was allowed to operate sort of privately. And I can't say he had his own ski school, but Dave allowed him to kind of do his own thing. He had the connection. If you wanted to race cars or you wanted to learn about skiing, Pino was the man. And they came flocking up here. Many of them stayed at our house. This was our family wagon. It was a Ferrari 212 Export. This sold for a couple $1 million at Pebble Beach, this car. But the one I like to talk about the most was the very first car that Alberto Scarry raced in the Miglia, 1948 Ferrari Barchetta, the first of the prototypes. And this car, for you car guys, is one of the most valuable Ferraris in the world. And his parents sent it to him in Hollywood before he came to Mammoth, before I was born, in fact. And he drove all around Beverly Hills and Hollywood, and the movie stars would come out of the woodworks and say, "Hey, is that a Ferrari?" They were just new back then. There was a guy that came off on a motorcycle. He had Coke bottles on a Harley Davidson, and he said, "Whose car is that?" It was at a pizza joint. My dad said, "It's mine." He said, "I'll let you ride my motorcycle if you let me drive your car around the block." Turned out to be James Dean. Jimmy. My dad called him Jimmy, and they became very good friends. And he worked at that time at a place called International Motors. It was the place if you wanted to get a sports car. And he dealt with the Italian cars. There was another guy that dealt with the German cars by the name of Johnny von Neumann, and another guy that dealt with the French cars. And he just had a wonderful life. And then we moved up to the United States, and we up to Mammoth, and we saw Mammoth grow little by little. My brother and I attended Mammoth Elementary when it was down at the Huck Creeks down there. Of course, you know that. We took this bus ride, this long bus ride. You remember the bus driver, his name? Mr. Deere. Oh boy. I remember Mr. Deere. He used to terrorize us. And we lived on Mono Street, and we had a Malamute that was very famous, a beautiful Malamute. And one day it got in a fight with the dogs of the Wardas. And all of a sudden our dog was like the queen. And whenever I met we had to meet at the main street here to catch the bus. Bruce and I would come with a pack of 12 dogs because our dog had just became the queen of this pack. And we had this beautiful Malamute that they allowed us to bring up to the hill all the time. Kenai. It was supposed to be in a movie called Nikki, Wild Dog of the North, but she had been spaded and Walt Disney didn't want to use her, but they canvassed for her. So, anyhow, in 2006, that's when they started doing research on the book. It took 10 years to make. I helped in the writing of that. Here's a picture of my father. Last year, he's 91 years old on his motorcycle. This is a picture of him just at the same time. This is Tom Holland. I happen to say I'm very instrumental in getting the deal for the movie. And it's now going to be a mini-series instead of a movie. And that's a good thing. I didn't like it. I thought, I envisioned Bruce and I walking up to the Academy Awards. Not going to happen. It has to be the Emmys first. And anyhow, Tom Holland is very excited about the movie. He's the kid that plays Spider-Man. Any questions? Real quick.